Today's presentation is one of the presentations that we worked on developing at the height of the pandemic. Hopefully we have ironed out a number of kinks, both on the interpretive end, but also on the technology end. With that in mind, I think we should get started with today's topic. The Lost City of Jackson, as I like to call it, or as longtime Arlington residents might know it, Jackson City. Admittedly, the title for this program, The Lost City of Jackson, was not one that I developed. A little bit of background into this program in particular. I was a graduate student at the George Mason's history program about 2 years ago, during which time I had to design a hypothetical museum exhibit on a topic of my choosing. I chose a subject that I was starting to learn more and more about as part of my day job in Arlington County, and that I thought would be really interesting. That was the rich and sometimes notorious history of the neighborhood known oftentimes simply as Jackson City. When I was coming up with a name for this exhibit, my professor actually was the one who put forward this particular title, saying, a lost city is something that can attract attention, it can spark interest, it captures the imagination, and he was right on all of those fronts. But more so than just being a catchy title, I think it really does capture a lot of the mystery of the Jackson City neighborhood, a lot of the subject matter that keeps Arlington residents coming back to this program, wanting to learn more and more about this strange little piece of Arlington County history. I think Jackson City is one of the neighborhoods I'm asked about more than any other because it does have something of a reputation. So with all that in mind, I want to put forward the disclaimer that today is not going to be be all end all definitive history of the Jackson City neighborhood. People have dedicated their entire lives to preserving Arlington County history. Jackson City is no different from that, and I won't do them a disservice by mentioning some things and not mentioning other things. Rather, I'm just going to focus on some of the broad points, some of the big focal points of Jackson City history that keep us coming back time and again, trying to learn more about this neighborhood. So with that in mind, let's get started. Now, if we're going to talk about Jackson City, we have to talk about its origins. Where does the name come from? When does it start appearing in the record? And why has it stuck around this long? Now, it's important to remember that long before anyone had the name Jackson City on their lips, long before there was really a state of Virginia, a District of Columbia, any of the surrounding settlements or landmarks that we know of today, this subsection of central Arlington, right on the coast of the Potomac River, was in fact the home to some of Arlington County's first peoples, the Nacotchtunk people. We know from the Potomac River expedition of Captain John Smith in 1608 that long before European settlers arrived in this part of Virginia, the greater central Arlington area was pinpointed as the location for the town of Namerikend, or Namerikena. Namerikend was a Native American settlement located on the south side of the Potomac River, opposite the Native American town of Nacotchtunk. Nacotchtunk, Smith loosely interpreted to mean trading town, and it's believed by historians today that Nacotchtunk and Namerikena were twin cities on either sides of the Potomac River, from which the Nacotchtunk people controlled a lot of the trade that went up and down the Potomac River, going south towards the Chesapeake and into the Powhatan Confederacy, and then further north into modern-day West Virginia, modern-day Ohio, into the Iroquois Confederacies as well. I always bring this up because whenever we're looking at Central Arlington in its broadest sense, or Jackson City in its most specific sense, it's always important to remember that long before European settlement, long before the beginning of the recorded history we see in our textbooks today, the Jackson City area really is the center of a thriving trading empire. This is going to be a crossroads of trade between not just some of the largest Native American confederacies on the East Coast, but also through their capacity as proxies for French and English nation states across the ocean in Europe. So remember this: there is always going to be a lot of activity located right along the bend of the Potomac River, no matter what name we give the region. Now, moving forward in time a little bit, the name Jackson City is going to come about 230 years after the events that I've just described. We're now fast forwarding from 1608 to 1836. 1836 is a very tumultuous time for the United States, especially if you lived in or around the District of Columbia. You see, when the District of Columbia was first established, when it was first mapped out in 1791, it was not the strange half diamond shape that we now associate it as today. It was not just that weird half diamond shape on the north side of the Potomac River. Rather, it was a complete diamond shape that included land on the south side of the Potomac as well. The borders of the south side of the District of Columbia are essentially the modern day borders of Arlington County and Old Town Alexandria as well. What this effectively meant was that you had a section of the District of Columbia that was otherwise separate from all of the power brokerage in the federal capital. It was easy for the people of Georgetown, the people of Maryland, to become associated with the District of Columbia because that was ultimately where the federal city was built. That was where the federal capital of Washington was built. But if you lived in Alexandria City, or if you lived in what would become Arlington County, you were in the rural part of the district. You had no federal city to call your own. You were cut off from federal jobs, you were cut off from limited federal infrastructure, and there really was a large disconnect between the two sides of the Potomac, the two sides of the district. So, one of the ways that early thinkers are going to try and fix this idea is there to put forward this idea of perhaps building a second federal city on the south side of the Potomac River, one that would marry Alexandria to the federal district in the same way that Washington had married Georgetown to the federal district. The first mentions of a new federal city are going to come in 1836 at the start of the second term of President Andrew Jackson. The ads for this proposed new city will begin to circulate in New York City newspapers in 1836. A land corporation is going to start putting forward this idea that they are purchasing land in the Arlington coastal area at a rapid speed for the express purpose of getting their land patents incorporated as a new federal city, a city that they would very generously name after the sitting president, Andrew Jackson. At face value, this seems like a great idea. Andrew Jackson is very supportive of the idea. He would love to have a city named after himself. It's also going to gain some support from notable Arlington and Alexandria residents, most notably George Washington Parke Custis, who was a big supporter of Andrew Jackson and one of the biggest landowners on the south side of the Potomac District. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of pushback to this idea. There are lots of people in Washington and in Congress in particular who are very apprehensive of this idea, even if the president himself is on board. Now, Jackson is going to jump feet first into this idea for a new city. And on January 11th, 1863, he is at, 1836, January 11th, he is going to lead a full-scale procession from Washington, D.C., over the Long Bridge that connects Washington to central Arlington. And upon arriving on the Arlington shore, he will plant a cornerstone at modern-day Gravelly Point, approximately the location of Long Bridge Park or the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary. He is going to place this cornerstone. He is going to be accompanied by tradesmen guilds, a military procession. He will be marching in tow with a number of different congressional representatives, both from the House of Representatives and from the U.S. Senate. He will be accompanied by distinguished Army officers, by his cabinet members. George Washington Parke Custis will give a rousing speech on the occasion, claiming that they are now ushering in a brand new era for the south side of the district. And by all accounts, it looks like this could be the start of something great. This could be the start of a brand new federal city. So, what happens? Um, to put it bluntly, Congress is not as excited for Jackson City as President Andrew Jackson is. And whether you like Andrew Jackson or you dislike him, you probably have a problem with this proposal. On the one hand, Andrew Jackson is a very divisive president. I'd even go as far as to say he might be the most divisive president we have ever had. He was responsible largely for a divide in the Democratic Republican Party. Prior to his nomination for president, the Democratic Republican Party really was the only political party in the United States. And following his failed attempt to win the presidency in 1824, and then his successful attempt to run for president in 1828, the fragile unity of the Democratic Party is shattered, with politicians now identifying not as Democratic Republicans, but as anti-Jackson or pro-Jackson candidates. So there's a lot of pushback to Jackson and really anything that could honor him. Similarly, there is also a little bit of concern with the congressional representatives in terms of what creating a brand new city would mean. At this point in time, Washington has very little municipal oversight. Congress are the direct administrators for the District of Columbia. And so any kind of incorporation of new land patents into a new federal city, well, Congress views this as being tantamount to becoming landlords, speculators, a very uncomfortable idea for the relatively small government group that occupies Congress in the 1830s. So just apprehension alone of the implications of this Jackson City land deal are enough to turn people away. Now, finally, you even have diehard supporters of Andrew Jackson who are some of the most outspoken enemies of the Jackson City plan because they're of the opinion that this is all one big land scam. These are land developers coming to the district from New York City trying to get rich off of the name of their hero, President Jackson. So in March of 1836, just about 3 months after Jackson's grand procession across the Potomac, Congress will actually vote against the incorporation of Jackson City by a pretty significant margin, by a margin of about 2-1. And so almost as soon as the dream of Jackson City is formed, it is shot down. The end result of this is that, well, by by again, March, April 1861, you suddenly have to start associating Jackson City with failures. As you'll see right here on our next slide, 1836 to 1843, Jackson City becomes something of a buzzword among local newspaper writers, local columnists. People will frequently refer to Jackson City in pretty mocking terms. Sometimes people even going as far as to associate it with the local example of a bad land deal or a humbug, if you will. The term humbug is thrown around quite frequently when referring to Jackson City. People will say, "Oh, that agreement is worth about as much as a land patent in Jackson City." It's a term of derision for Central Arlington. Now, a few things are going to happen in the early 1840s. First off, by that point, there's really only one person living in and around the Jackson City neighborhood. The only real landowner is one Richard B. Mason, a descendant of the famous George Mason, and living with him as well are anywhere around 3 enslaved men who are working the property with him. Now, tragedy is going to strike for Mason and for the 3 unnamed men, or excuse me, the 3 men named Phil, Gabriel, and Sandy, when in November of 1840, a freak accident is going to cause Richard Mason to drown in the Potomac River. And at the sale of his deed of trust, all 3 of those enslaved men, Phil, Gabriel, and Sandy, are going to be sold off to account for Mason's debts. So all it takes is one freak Potomac River accident for the population of, quote, Jackson City, unquote, to suddenly disappear to zero. Flooding of the Jackson City region by the Potomac was frequently reported in newspapers as well. And at around the time of Mason's death, you also get some early mentions of a tavern cropping up in the Jackson City neighborhood. Uh, that's a significant update to the Jackson City story as well, because now, as early as 1840, you have Jackson City not simply being associated with bad land, bad luck, bad deals, but also with public drinking. Now, fast forward in time a little bit, the transition from city to fort. In 1847, the south side of the District of Columbia will be retroceded back to the state of Virginia. Within about 14 years of that retrocession, Virginia will find itself at war with the rest of the United States as Virginia votes to secede during the secession crisis, joining the growing Confederate States of America in the outbreak of the American Civil War. Now, anyone who's done a program with me knows that this really is my specialty in terms of subject matter, and getting a chance to talk about the Civil War history of Jackson City is always fun for me in and of itself. Now, here we have an image of the Long Bridge, the bridge that connected Washington to Arlington. The photo has been taken with the photographer standing on the DC side of the bridge, facing into Arlington, facing into Jackson City. You'll note that there's not much to see there. Again, by 1861, 1862, all the way up through 1865, very little has been built in Jackson City, with one major exception. At the end of that railroad bridge, the Union Army would build a fortification in September of 1861. The fortification was built directly across the railroad lines, so that the railroad actually cut through the earthworks. The earthworks abutted the railroad tracks on either side. This made it something of a fortified approach for the DC Railroad as it entered the state of Virginia. So the fort that's built here in Jackson City is one of the documented 22 fortifications that we include in the famous Arlington line defenses of Washington. The defenses built in Arlington County to protect Washington. Most of those fortifications were named after Union heroes, soldiers who had died during the war right before the forts were built. Some forts were built after the regiment's commanding officers that happened to be stationed there. Some forts were named after prominent Union politicians, people like Abraham Lincoln or William Seward. But the fort that's built at Jackson City is a little different. In what might be the only instance of this happening, certainly in Arlington and possibly anywhere around Washington, when the Union soldiers build their fort at Jackson City, they don't name it after one of their traditional sources of names, but rather they name it after the location they have built the fort. The fort is called Fort Jackson, or the fort at Jackson City. This is, again, really the only time you're going to see a Union fort around Washington named after the Virginia neighborhood in which it is built. While it might be impressive that federal development has finally come to Jackson City about 20 years or so after the failure of the city, it should be noted that the fort doesn't fare much better than the city itself. Brigadier General John Gross Barnard, chief engineer for the Department of Washington and master planner of the Arlington Line defenses, really didn't have many kind things about Jackson City when he wrote his master report on the defenses of Washington in 1871. He documented that Fort Jackson's trench line was always flooded, that no cannons were ever put in place on the earthwork battlements, that the fort itself was never garrisoned by any soldiers. In fact, when the forts of Arlington are starting to be decommissioned in the summer of 1865, Fort Jackson is one of the first forts that is shut down because it is no longer needed. So just like that, the humbug reputation of Jackson City has already spread to the Union fortification that's built on its grounds. It's starting to seem like this is a reputation for bad luck and mismanagement that the region is really going to have a hard time shaking. Now, new life will be blown into the region, especially in the late 1800s going into the early 1900s, when Jackson City is going to become notorious in local newspapers once again, this time as a neighborhood for drinking establishments. Um, like I said, the first mention of drinking in Jackson City in a public drinking house really does go back to the 1840s. And up to the early 1900s, Arlington County as a whole really carried that reputation with it, regardless of the neighborhoods. But a few neighborhoods in particular would often stand out. Neighborhoods like Jackson City and Roslyn, in particular, tended to bear the brunt of Arlington's less than reputable appearance to the District of Columbia. Now, this is part of a much larger disagreement between the two sides of the Potomac River. In the lead up to the 1900s, there is a really strong push for a temperance movement in the United States. This idea that drinking needs to be limited, if not outright abolished, and that the drinking establishments are the first places that need to be shut down by force if necessary. While the temperance movement starts to take a hold in the DC area, you do see disagreements between the two sides of the Potomac as to who is to blame for drinking in Arlington. On the one hand, the people of the District of Columbia place the blame squarely in Arlington County, where so many DC residents go across the river to engage in drinking and gambling. Meanwhile, the people of Arlington, of Virginia, take the opposite approach. They interpret this as people from Washington coming over to Arlington and drinking when they come, only to leave the county when they're done. Arlington is not the source of the drinking; rather, it is the unwitting recipient of the drinkers. And so, both sides really do blame the other in this rise in vice that you start to see correctly or incorrectly in Arlington and specifically in Jackson City. Now, this will all come to a head during a very infamous event that we have sometimes referred to as the burning of Jackson City. The burning of Jackson City was an event that Arlington Parks used to talk a little bit about in very sparse details, really before we knew too much about it. The official story went as such. In 1904, Commonwealth Attorney Crandall Mackey led a citizens mob across Jackson City and Roslyn, burning drinking establishments in an attempt to push illegal vice out of Arlington County. It was an interesting story. It captured a lot of attention, it captured a lot of excitement, and that was kind of where it ended. Now, in doing research for this program and for Jackson City as a whole, we've learned that the burning of Jackson City was a little more overplayed than that, and perhaps had a slightly darker undertone. Only one real newspaper reporting of the burning of Jackson City survives 1904. And in that newspaper article, it doesn't talk about a grand burning across a neighborhood. It doesn't talk about the storming of saloons, of the overturning of card tables. Rather, it talks about an assault against one saloon in particular, a saloon at Jackson City that was known to be inhabited by the county's African American population. It's important to remember that while Crandall Mackey is sometimes regarded in Arlington as our prohibition Commonwealth attorney, as our tough on crime Commonwealth attorney, he was representing a political party at the time that was very much opposed to integration, that was very much built on racial lines. And so when the quote unquote burning of Jackson City took place, we shouldn't be shocked to learn that his vigilance mob action was very targeted towards minority groups. We know that in the storming of this one hotel, somewhere around $2,000 worth of damage was done to the property, and at least one person fired a gun in the air at retreating saloon patrons. It just serves as a reminder that sometimes these legends that we develop around our neighborhoods and around the actions therein can change with time and can often be turned to suit an agenda that we have to reevaluate every so often. It's one of the reasons why we like doing this program and why I like highlighting just how much we've learned and just how much we are continuing to learn about the Jackson City neighborhood. Now, of course, today, if you are interested in learning more about Jackson City or the Long Bridge neighborhood as a whole, I strongly recommend visiting Long Bridge Park, the park that now joins the new Long Bridge Aquatic Center. It is the park that the Long Bridge Railroad bridge still runs through. It provides a wonderful view of the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary. And as of about 2 years ago, it has some new interpretive signs in place that help tell a greater story of the Jackson City neighborhood. Some of those old stories are still there, but we've tried to clean them up a little bit to give a more accurate depiction of, again, just the sort of hardships that have struck in this neighborhood, the ultimate successes that it has seen as a center for trade, for commerce, for community growth, and also the hardships that it's seen as really a battleground between opposing sides of the Potomac River, a battleground that it has been since long before the neighborhood was even an idea in the mind of the most ambitious real estate developer. And that really sums up my presentation. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Um, if anybody who has a question, feel free to type that into the chat or raise your hand. I'd be happy to answer it for you. But if you are all done, then I certainly hope you've enjoyed this introduction into Jackson City, one of our, again, most treasured neighborhoods here in Arlington. I hope you had fun, and I hope to see you at a new program. You guys were fantastic.
Hey, John, this is Lika. I wonder if it's a possibility if we could maybe have a walk around that area, because that would be good. I didn't know much about that area. I'm glad that you did this program.
You know, we most certainly can do a walk around that area. Anyone who's done these programs before with Ken Rosenthal from Gulf Branch Nature Center, he and I have a joint nature and history walk that we will occasionally do around the Long Bridge Park. Then we will get in our cars and we will drive to the other side where we will walk around the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary. Ken tells the nature stories, I tell the history stories. I don't know if we have one on the books for the winter season, but if that is a program that you are interested in, please let Charlika know. Charlika will let Ken and I know, and we are happy to put that one on the books really whenever we have time, because it's a lot of fun.
Okay, Tracy asks, did Jackson City have residents and population?
Did Jackson City have residents and population? A very good question. Not in the strictest sense. A city is never actually built. As far as I can tell, the developers in New York hire an architectural planner to survey a potential city. So in the Library of Congress, there is actually a map of the proposed grid that would have made Jackson City had it been built. And then we know that in 1836, after this procession, Jackson himself is going to plant a cornerstone somewhere in Gravelly Point. Again, sort of the Long Bridge area. Beyond that, though, no parcels are ever sold. No one ever kind of fills in the neighborhood, at least until kind of the explosion of Arlington as a suburban area when it ceases to be more farming. As far as I can tell, the only population that I know of in Jackson City prior to the 1840s really is Richard Mason, Phil, Gabriel, and Sandy. And again, that is a population that goes from 4 to 0 over the span of a single accidental drowning.
All right, and Debbie asks, how do we find out about these walks?
Oh, an excellent question. So, if you are interested in doing these walks through 55 plus, I strongly recommend letting Charlika know what walks you are interested in, because we at the Conservation and Interpretation Unit have a great relationship with Charlika. We love doing the 55 plus programs, and again, we are happy to tailor make the programs to your interests. Now, if you can't wait for the 55 plus schedule, or if you just want to get a sampling of what all is out there, I strongly recommend going to parks.arlingtonva.us. When you go there, look up nature and history programs. That should lead you to a PDF that is released seasonally and will advertise all of the nature and history walks put out by the Conservation and Interpretation Unit, of which I'm a part. If you are interested, I believe the next longer form hike we have coming up is a hike from Fort Ethan Allen to Fort Marcy, the Civil War defenses of Chain Bridge. That'll be happening this winter. Some of you may have done that with us maybe about a year ago. So that's always a lot of fun. It's the most intense hike you can pick up in an Arlington County park, so come prepared. If you want to learn more about Andrew Jackson and his effect on Arlington County, then I strongly recommend marking down April 8th in your calendars, because every April 8th, I do a series of walking tours around Ethan Allen where we discuss the infamous Henry Clay John Randolph duel of 1826, a duel that would not have been made possible without the non-election of Andrew Jackson. Again, some of you may have done that with us in the past. If you have not, check it out. It's one of my favorite hikes to lead.
Okay, Patty asks, what finally happened to Jackson City?
What finally happened to Jackson City? That's a great question. So nowadays, Jackson City is a very developed part of Arlington. That's where you're going to see, again, we talked about Longbridge Park and the Longbridge Aquatic Center. 395 in particular runs over a large chunk of that. You've got some development with the Boeing building as well, but it's also important to remember that Jackson City, in and of itself, has really continued to be a neighborhood where people have continued to live. So, while I couldn't tell you exactly at what point people stopped referring to it as Jackson City, or when it exactly became, an incorporated neighborhood, that's kind of when the county record keeping gets a little hard to follow. But in many ways, Jackson City is still there today. It's still thriving, and certainly older residents of Arlington County do still refer to it as such. So it's not something that has disappeared entirely. Again, I know I like saying, the lost city of Jackson, and while that is deserved, it's not completely lost. People have never left there.
Okay, is there a historical marker in that area?
Is there a historical marker? A great question. Not for Jackson City that I'm aware of. If you go to the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary, you will see some interpretive signage that is dedicated to the Roach property that would ultimately become the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary. That is a National Park Service site, so we don't have any oversight over that in Arlington Parks. You will see some clever signage and sidewalk interpretation over at the Boeing building to commemorate Fort Runyon, which was the next fortification over from Fort Jackson and would have been built approximately where the Boeing building is today. I believe there's an interpretive sign for Fort Jackson on the road, but honestly, it's been so long since I've been over there, and Fort Jackson is such an overlooked fort within an overlooked section of forts that that one could have quietly disappeared and I wouldn't know. I can tell you though that again there is some good historical information inside Longbridge Park. So if you go to Longbridge Park, odds are you will be directed to the parking lot by the soccer field. If you park there, there is a walkway up to a large large elevated platform that you can walk up and down again. You can see the waterfowl sanctuary. You can see the D-Ski skyline. There's a nice little overlook where you can see Washington, where you can see the Pentagon, where you can see Crystal City, all the real landmarks of Arlington and of the district. And as you're going to Longbridge, as you're taking in the sights, you will see signs here and there that commemorate varied points in history of the Longbridge neighborhood. So Jackson City is included in that, but to my knowledge, there is not a designated historical marker. No.
Okay, another question. Were people from Jackson City relocated to build the Pentagon?
Ooh, now that is a very good question. Uh, that I am not entirely sure of. The Pentagon is actually going to be built on the remains of another fortification. Again, you have 22 Union Army fortifications built in Arlington County alone. That's basically from Fairlington to Chain Bridge. You've got 22 forts, and the remains of those forts can be found everywhere, even if the earthworks don't survive. The Pentagon takes up almost the entirety of one of those fortifications. Um, so I could not tell you exactly if anyone is moved from that specific location, but more likely than not, you are going to see people moved uh, on the opposite side of 395, because that's where you get Arlington National Cemetery. And Arlington National Cemetery does have a legacy of relocating some of our county's older neighborhoods for the purpose of accumulating more cemetery space. So that is a problem in that particular part of Arlington at large. I just could not tell you exactly if it happened in Jackson City or if it was the Pentagon specifically that did it.
I don't see any more questions. Thank you, John.
My pleasure. Very, very happy to see everyone again. Again, always happy to work with 55 plus. I did see there was a question in the chat about getting a copy of the slideshow presentation. I have already sent that to Charlika. So, Charlika, if you want to share that with anybody who wants it, you are free to pass that along.
Will do. I'll pass it on. I'll forward it on to everyone.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
No problem. You all have a good one. Thank you, John. Thank you so much.
Anytime, anytime. You guys have a great night.